Hiya, BookTube. You'll notice no change of scenery compared to Sunday's video, and that's because I have just gone straight on to recording this. And this, of course, is Middlemarch Meditations. Yes, number 14. And we're at the beginning of chapter 6, pages 52 to 54 we're going to look at. And we are meeting a character, a huge personality, or so it seems, that will dominate this chapter. And I say that, but I don't get the impression that they dominate after that. Now, I formed this opinion based on two things. There was a remark made by the booktuber Joseph Francis Burton. Heavens, where's my head today? And he's going to have to forgive me, because not only am I relying on my memory to get his name right, which is obviously failing, but I'm relying on my memory of what he actually said. But the remarks that he made suggested something to the effect of this character they really don't turn out to play a big role, or they're really not well fleshed out. It'd be one of those two things. He's going to correct me, so I'm not too worried about that. And also, I found a real lack of mentions about this character or analysis in academic journals. I mean, you can find no end of material about Middlemarch on JSTOR. So much, but little or nothing about this person, Mrs. Cadwallader. And yet, it's such a dramatic entrance. I mean, if Middlemarch were a film, it has been a film. But what I mean is, if I were making a film of Middlemarch, and let's say I was going to stage the beginning of chapter 6 exactly as it is in the novel, well, wouldn't the viewer conclude, we'll get to it in a minute, but the viewer, I think, would conclude, wow, we're really meeting somebody now. This is a person that is significant to the plot, perhaps, and we're really going to get to know them, because look at them, taking over this chapter, charging in, literally. I did manage to find one academic, though, who proposed that Mrs. Cadwallader might not be a realistic person on purpose, that Eliot was looking to illustrate a social function rather than create an individual. And this is our writer, Jean Arnold, on Quitting Middlemarch. I'll also put these details down in the description box if you want to follow that link through. Now, before she talks about Mrs. Cadwallader, Jean Arnold talks more generally about the novel's title. She asks what's in a name and examines the very word Middlemarch, right? I found it really fascinating, so I'm going to read this passage out loud. Just noting the possibilities of meaning for the town name Middlemarch, however, could help us to think flexibly about the whole problem of living in this fictional Midlands community. Consider the common meaning of march as a verb, to walk with regular step in time with others who, as a group, step forward in the same direction. Rules must be followed. Placement in the group is non-negotiable, right, once assigned. One might picture a military parade or a musical band playing John Philip Sousa. I don't think it matters what you play in a marching band, you've got to get it right. Here one would want to ask if the people of the fictional town of Middlemarch walk and live in metaphorical formation, so that their steps keep the community moving in unison and in a direction predetermined by tradition. A second meaning for march designates a boundary, and that's true in Old Anglo-Saxon, a common English noun originally referring to marshes as a natural border. A march defines the space dividing home territory from what lies outside the domain of home. However, if the march is in the middle of the territory, as Eliot's fictional town name also suggests, that placement could imply that there are borders or frontiers right at home. Yeah, the two names together, Middlemarch, thus bring up the idea that while there may be margins that exist at the geographical periphery of the town, there are also borders that embed themselves in the middle of society as well. This definition complicates the idea of Middlemarch immensely, for a society can actually throw up barriers for its citizens right in its center. Let us not forget Uncle Brooks' repeated advice to many of the characters that they engage in their projects only, quote, up to a certain point. We'll hear that phrase. For example, when he confers with, oh dear, I didn't cut the rest of that passage. Okay, I must have thought it was time now to comment on it. But with that thought in mind, Jean Arnold went on later, the passage I didn't clip. She talked about the function of gossip in the Middlemarch community as a force for control, keeping everyone in their position, marching in time. And Mrs. Cadwallader, therefore, it's true she might not, we'll find, be a satisfyingly complex character. And I think Joseph Francis Burton felt that. But the reason that Jean Arnold is suggesting she makes such a big entrance here may have more to do with her function as keeper of these social, cultural boundaries, making sure people do not get out of line, out of step, out of time, slightly flat, all that stuff. What George Eliot thought of Mrs. Cadwallader, we can only speculate from the epigraph, which appears at the beginning of the chapter. So now we need to get to the beginning of the chapter. So let's do that. Let's put page 52 up here. I'm so sorry, Mr. Pigeon. We're just gonna move in front of you there. So it would be a bit weird if I kept his head sticking out. Right. So you can read here. My lady's tongue is like the meadow blades that cut you, stroking them with idle hand. Nice cutting is her function. She divides with spiritual edge the millet seed and makes intangible savings. It's a lovely thought because, of course, you've got 3 words there. I'm using red pencil in this chapter just to look at words that make me think of sharpness or cutting in one way or t'other. It might be very, loose association, but for me, it's there. So, yes, you've got blades, cut, cutting, divides. 4 words that just keep, like the fall of a blade. And I love this with spiritual edge, the millet seed. A millet seed, the little things that budgies eat, right? I mean, how you would even cut that, I don't know. And if you're only making an intangible savings on a millet seed, yeah, we're talking about angels on the heads of pins now, I think. Right. So let us begin and go into this because it's quite interesting, some of the text. It says, as Mr. Casaubon's carriage was passing out of the gateway, it arrested the entrance of a pony phaeton. And right away, I wanted to point out the 2 vehicles, the big difference between them, because the drivers and the vehicles are such an indicator of wealth. A carriage has always got an enclosed passenger space, and it's never driven by the owner. The owner sits inside, out of the weather, and there's always some sort of servant who sits out front and does the driving. It's clear, of course, in this paragraph if we read on, because it says, it arrested the entrance of a pony phaeton driven by a lady with a servant seated behind. So we'll come back to that. It was doubtful whether the recognition had been mutual, for Mr. Casaubon was looking absently before him, but the lady was quick-eyed. So we know 2 things. It's doubtful Mr. Casaubon was driving, because you just don't look absently before you when you've got horses to direct. So he's obviously inside a carriage. It's possible for him not to pay any attention to who's coming through the gates, but not so for the lady driving the pony phaeton. Now, a phaeton, it may be covered. Some of them have covers overhead. But the big difference with a phaeton is the driving seat is also the best seat. And so it's not necessarily true that a servant would sit in the best seat. They might do, but more likely a phaeton often has a seat facing the other way behind the main seat, and that's often where the servant will sit. And that seems to be the case here. It's driven by a lady with a servant seated behind, but for a lady to be driving and traveling solo, a phaeton is the kind of vehicle, I think in Northanger Abbey there was a phaeton. And it was for it was the vehicle in which isn't it terrible how in which Kathy finally gets to spend a little time together with the young man that she's very interested in, whose name has completely left my head. I should have written it down. But they're in a phaeton. So a phaeton it would probably be driven by a man, but it has one other nice seat. And of course, guess who would get to sit there? Probably a young lady that you're very interested in and want to spend a little time with. But in this case, no, being driven by a lady solo, and for her to do that, for her to do her own driving, to be uncovered in the open air and not having a servant do all this stuff for her, it means that maybe she didn't have better choices than that. Now, let's go on. So Mr. Casaubon was looking absently before him, but the lady was quick-eyed, which I still felt was sharpness, the ability to spot things. And so the lady threw a nod and a how do you do in the nick of time. Yeah, again, I don't think these are accidental. In spite her shabby bonnet and very old Indian shawl. So again, indicators of wealth, comparative wealth, possibly not doing so well. And of course, this becomes a principal point. So let's see. So it was plain that the lodge-keeper regarded her as an important personage from the low curtsy which was dropped on the entrance of the small phaeton. And now we get our first words. Well, Mrs. Fitchett, how are your fowls laying now? Okay, laying now, said the high-coloured, dark-eyed lady. Now we should just explain high-coloured because that has a different meaning now. At the time, in the mid-19th century, that would have meant probably someone with, is it rosacea, or some other reason for redness in the skin. People like me with pale eyes and pale hair, I have to, have to be really nice to my skin, otherwise I get that, really big rose patches. So obviously, but it could also mean sunburnt. Again, therefore, an indication that this lady maybe spent a lot of time exposed to the outdoor air, something that ladies normally would not want to do at that time. Maybe not having a parasol or a hat or other skin protection, and therefore, reddening up around the cheeks and forehead and so on. So that's what it means by high-colored and dark-eyed. And of course, she says her words with the clearest chiseled utterance. So again, another cutting metaphor. And Mrs. Fitchett answers her and confesses that her hens, these fowls, have taken to eating their eggs. Now, this is something that I thought, not having raised any chickens at all, let's be fair, I thought, was this made up? And so, of course, I went on Google, didn't I? And it turns out, no, very common problem. In fact, there are 10 ways to prevent chickens from eating their eggs. And I thought you might want to enjoy this. So this is a comic interlude. 10 ways to prevent your chickens from eating their eggs. 1, you make sure they're getting enough protein, right? So you read up on what to feed chickens, because lack of protein, they might start checking out their own eggs in order to, get the easiest way to get protein is what you're sitting on. You want to keep the eggshell strong, so you want to make sure your hens are getting enough calcium, because if they're not, they'll also want the eggshells. Put a wooden egg or a golf ball in the nesting box. It says here, the chicken will peck it, hoping to break the egg open, and they'll eventually give up when they find it's unbreakable. This is an interesting one. Fill an empty egg with English mustard. Sounds, yeah. Anyway, chickens don't like mustard, apparently. So this is supposed to put, it sounds a little bit unreasonable. 5, collect eggs frequently. It says that really you should try to collect eggs 2 to 3 times a day. Oh, wow, okay. Provide a cushioned nesting box. And of course it says here, no, you don't need to sew an actual cushion. Just make sure there is enough natural material in the box that when the hen lays an egg, it falls softly and doesn't crack. See what? Keep nesting boxes dim or dark. Okay, I guess that's so they can't find the eggs, can't see the eggs. I don't know. Only feed your chickens cooked or scrambled. I didn't even know people fed their chickens eggs. There you go. But apparently a lot of people do supplement their chicken's diet with eggs, thus giving them a taste for eggs. There we go. 9, build or buy slanted nesting boxes. I don't know how slanted. I was trying to imagine how this might work. You can buy or build nesting boxes that are slanted so that when the hen lays her egg, it rolls away and out of her sight. And I was thinking, how far? Anyway, I don't have to do this. Shouldn't worry. 10, give them plenty of things to do and peck at. Apparently, bored or overcrowded chickens are more likely to peck at their eggs. So we don't know which of these reasons might have caused Mrs. Fitchett's hens to eat their own eggs, but apparently they were doing that. And Mrs. Cadwallader is not pleased with them. They're cannibals. Cannibals. Again, I thought of cutting. I don't know why, because, I presume a cannibal has to do a little bit of work. I presume they don't just bite into people. I wouldn't know. So she says, better sell them cheap at once. For what? Yeah, what will you sell them? A couple. One can't eat fowls of a bad character at a high price. And then follows a little bit of interesting negotiation about how much should be paid for these hens. And it seems pretty clear that Mrs. Cadwallader works very hard to negotiate the lowest price possible for herself. So, and in fact, she's offering Mrs. Fitchett a pair of tumbler pigeons. Again, something I had to look up. I'm not a pigeon fancier, but there are various breeds of tumbler pigeon. And what characterizes them is their ability to turn somersaults in midair. That's it. I mean, they aren't, as far as I was able to discover, any more useful than that. I don't even know if they're good eating. It seems to me that in exchange for 2 laying hens who might just have a calcium deficiency or be a bit bored, Mrs. Fitchett, the gatekeeper's wife, is going to get 2 acrobatic pigeons, and then she's got to consider the sermons that she gets from Mrs. Cadwallader's husband as half payment. So there we go. And Mrs. Cadwallader ends the conversation by saying, well, hang on, there's a little bit too, which talks about, yes, Master Fitchett shall go and see them after work. He's very hot on new sorts to oblige you. That's in italics. So there's a social thing going on there. It's like, yeah, we don't really do this for us, we do this for you. And of course, Mrs. Cadwallader pretends that she's concerned that they would do such a thing, denies it, and says, oh no, this would be the best bargain he ever made. And she considers the fowl suddenly to be Spanish, and I'm not sure whether that's just prior knowledge, because it's clear that she's talked to Mrs. Fitchett about these hens before, or whether they're Spanish because they're wicked. I'll come to that, because she has an interesting opinion of Catholics, and so possibly Catholic-speaking countries. Perhaps all Catholics are just lumped together. We'll come to that. That is the end of page 52. So we're going to look at page 53. Whoopsie. We're going to try to, anyway, if I can learn how to manipulate these images. You'd think by now I would be really good at this, and you wouldn't be waiting for me to sort myself out. Well, the phaeton was driven onwards with the last words. In other words, before Mrs. Fitchett could add a sentence or make a reply, Mrs. Cadwallader drove on toward the house. So she cut the conversation as well. It's very interesting how. But even though Mrs. Fitchett appears to have been, I think, dealt a bad deal, and then summarily dismissed by Mrs. Cadwallader driving off, she was laughing. She was laughing and shaking her head slowly with an interjectional surely, surely, from which it might be inferred, I guess, that she would have found the countryside somewhat duller if the rector's lady had been less free-spoken and less of a skinflint. Well, okay, this is a very interesting observation, because again, we're thinking, well, why does she like this woman so much? What's the reason? And yet the narrator is insisting here. Indeed, both the farmers and labourers in the parishes of Freshitt and Tipton would have felt a sad lack of conversation, but for the stories about what Mrs. Cadwallader said and did. And here's an interesting bit. A lady of immeasurably high birth, descended, as it were, from unknown earls, dim as the crowd of heroic shades, who pleaded poverty, pared down prices, and cut jokes in the most, and again there's another cut, in the most companionable manner, though with a turn of tongue that let you know who she was. Such a lady gave a neighbourliness to both rank and religion, and mitigated the bitterness of the uncommuted tithe. That's a tithe which was paid in produce rather than in cash. So mitigated the bitterness. It's weird, because what the narrator seems to be insisting is Mrs. Cadwallader, she makes the interactions between, I guess, the better off in this community and the less well off. She somehow, I don't know, she makes it work? It seems strange to me, because it appears to me that all she does is make people kind of, maybe for laughing at her, not realize that they're not being treated very well, which you'd think would get a different reaction. But then again, there could be a hidden humor in this. Isn't it bizarre how, and in a way, I think I've observed this, but not as much, but you still see a little bit of this in England, this sense that when someone is of a certain social rank, we still do sometimes overlook what's really happening. I suppose that's why we still have a monarchy. Dare I say it? We are overlooking. Not all of us, though, right? Okay. Apologies to the Republicans out there who are going, "Excuse me, didn't mean it. Didn't mean it." Right, right. So again, the end of the paragraph does say it would have been less socially uniting. That if they'd had a different one, I think the sentence reads a much more exemplary character. In other words, somebody besides Mrs. Cadwallader, if they were performing the same role, it would have been less socially uniting. That there was something about this woman that brought together the classes in both communities. I must admit, I'm going, I don't know what that is, and yet I just know from, it's almost intuitively from experience. I thought, yeah, that does happen, but it doesn't make any sense. But there you go. There you go. Bear with me while I just scroll down in my notes because I get lost. Right. Now we come to the good bit because, of course, Mrs. Cadwallader, she obviously she gets on very, very well with Mrs. Freshett. However, Mr. Brooke, seeing Mrs. Cadwallader's merits from a different point of view, winced a little when her name was announced in the library where he was sitting alone. So, and again, I marked that in red because winced, because I thought, yeah, cut. And what Mrs. Cadwallader starts into is a discussion of politics. Also very curious. She remarks on Mr. Casaubon having been here, but then she goes on to say, I suspect you and he are brewing some bad politics, else you would not be seeing so much of the lively man. Okay, she's making fun of him. I shall inform against you. Remember, you are both suspicious characters since you took Peel's side about the Catholic bill. So she's referring to the recent legislation which emancipated Catholics. And we will talk more because as she goes down the page, she gets more and more vociferous about this. I shall tell everybody that you are going to put up for Middlemarch on the Whig side when old Pinkerton resigns, and that Casaubon is going to help you in an underhand manner, going to bribe the voters with pamphlets and throw open the public houses to distribute them. Come, confess. So she's really driving here. Now, Mr. Brooke seems to know how to handle her because he says, he smiles and rubs his eyeglasses, as he's replying, and tries to dismiss it. Says, no. Casaubon and I don't talk politics. Well, that much we know as readers. He doesn't care much about the philanthropic side of things, punishments and that kind of thing. We know that too. He only cares about church questions. That's not my line of action, Now, I'm not sure. When Mrs. Cadwallader replies, rather too much, my friend, does she mean you protest too much, therefore what you say is actually untrue? That is when you say, church things are not my line of action, or I'm not doing what you think I'm doing. Is she saying, no, you protest too much? Maybe that's what she is. She says, I have heard of your doings. Who was it that sold his bit of land to the papists at Middlemarch? Now, I don't know, that's some kind of backstory that we haven't heard about. And I'm going to go straight on to page 54 because we want her argument's really going strong here, so we'll want to keep up with it. So, she says, I believe you bought it on purpose. Now, here's where she gets good. She said, you are a perfect, and she says, Guilford. Now, Guilford, for UK people are going to know who this is right away, but outside the UK, everyone, she's referring to an individual that we now call Guy Fawkes in the UK, but I believe he was Guido Fawkes. Some people are going to know more about this in history than I do. And this was a gentleman who, together with another group of conspirators, he was one of a group of English Catholics around the reign of James I, so the king who succeeded Elizabeth I, James I. And what these group of Catholics did was they plotted to blow up Parliament. They literally went into the cellars underneath the meeting room where Parliament sat, and they managed to get gunpowder down there in quantity. I don't know how, but they did. Now, their barrels of gunpowder were discovered in the cellars the night before, literally. And Guido Fawkes, or Guilford, or Guy Fawkes, whatever you want to call him, the poor fellow, he was the one guarding the barrels that night. And so he was arrested and he was tortured in ways that you can look up if you like to read about that kind of thing. He was tortured until he revealed the names of some of his co-conspirators. 8 of the 13 in that group were tried, found guilty of high treason in 1606. And again, if you want to read how they were punished, look it up. It's not nice. It's not nice. So this is again another Middlemarch reference to the 17th century, but very interesting because it shows that what Mrs. Cadwallader is very, very worried about is conformity religiously, and also you'll see conformity politically. She almost sees them as rather bound together, kind of. But you'll see, she says, "You are a perfect Guy Faux. See if you are not burnt in effigy this 5th of November coming." Well, of course, 5th of November has not long gone, and across the UK, well, we more likely now have fireworks, but there are still a lot of places where they do make bonfires, and you do burn an effigy of the guy. It was something that was actually a law passed in Parliament shortly after the execution of all these conspirators. A law was passed that every 5th of November, bonfires would be built to commemorate the capturing of these men. Yeah, so this is her concern. I don't know whether she still perceives that Catholics themselves are a real threat, or is she just being conservative? And since conservative at that point in time was meant to be anti-Catholic, she was just opposing any kind of social change, anything. I mean, in a way, there's something similar between her and Mr. Casaubon. I mean, there's also not. If we think about that, both Mr. Casaubon and Mrs. Cadwallader don't really like the way things have got to in the present day. The difference is, of course, that Casaubon's sympathies, where he would like to go back to, is something that predates the Protestant Reformation, and that's not the case with Mrs. Cadwallader. The Protestant Reformation is when truth happened, as far as she's concerned. So they're a bit different that way, but they're both reacting to the present day they live in, when things are beginning to change and they're not happy about it. She goes on about him. He's going to be burnt in effigy, and Humphrey would not come to quarrel with you about it, so I am come. She said, now that's interesting. So she's saying, my husband isn't like this. I do all this. I do all this. Very interesting for a woman to take it upon herself to do this. And we'll see that as the page goes on, that Mr. Brooke almost accuses her of breaking with tradition by what she's doing. But you'll see. Anyway, Mr. Brooke, still trying to be good-natured, he said, very good, very good. I was prepared to be persecuted for not persecuting. Not persecuting, meaning I did nice things for Catholics, and I knew I was going to get in trouble for it, but I was prepared. And that's a very nice turn of phrase, which, of course, Mrs. Cadwallader is unhappy because he makes such a nice turn of phrase. She says, there you go. That is a piece of claptrap that you have got ready for the hustings. In other words, you have got ready for political campaigning. Now, do not let them, you know what that means, I presume that means Catholics, lure you to the hustings, my dear Mr. Brooke. A man always makes a fool of himself, speechifying. There's no excuse but being on the right side, so that you can ask a blessing on your humming and hawing. You will lose yourself. I forewarn you. You will make a Saturday pie of all parties' opinions and be pelted by everybody. So her concern seems to be having any other opinion than just, apparently there's one. There's a way of looking at things. What does she say? Being on the right side. Just get over there, stay there. All this other stuff, not good, not good. And of course, then what we're beginning to get a portrait of is what Mr. Brooke does in his private life, which was we knew that he participated in trials or something, because we saw him go to court in aid of the sheep stealer. But it looks as though, if I read him right, because he goes on to say, that is what I expect, what I expect as an independent man. As to the Whigs, so of course you had 2 main parties. You still do, but you have 3 now. But you had 2 main parties in the early part of the 19th century. You had Conservatives, Tories, as they were called, Tories and Whigs. And Whigs at that point were difficult to say because there's differences now between conservatism and liberalism. Things have evolved, but Whigs were newer and yeah, generally disliked by conservatives. So he says, as to the Whigs, a man who goes with the thinkers is not likely to be hooked on by any party, and that's what he's obviously saying about himself. He may go with them up to a certain point. There he is saying it, up to a certain point, But that is what you ladies never understand. Now he's got his weapons out. Because all the while, Mrs. Cadwallader seems to be arguing that there is a position, there is a place that you must not deviate from. In other words, think back to Jean Arnold's business about marching in line. There's a place you should be, right? This is the pace you should go. This is the music we're playing. And he's coming back to her with the one thing that he can, which is, you're a woman and you're talking politics. Now, if we're going to talk about stepping out of line, Mrs. Cadwallader does go on and try to argue with him some more, and he counters. He says, I don't pretend to argue with a lady on politics. What he could have said, if he wanted to be blunter, was, you shouldn't be talking politics. Right? Women have no vote, no property. So politics aren't where you should be. So he's subtly he's trying to say, you're the one not marching in step, Mrs. Cadwallader, if I might say, pot calling kettle black, little hypocritical. But it does say he is feeling rather unpleasantly conscious that this attack had opened up the defensive campaign to which certain rash steps had exposed him. So really, he does have to go on the defensive, but he's doing, I think, a good job, because he's getting out all the traditional stuff, the claptrap about women. Your sex are not thinkers, and then he quotes Virgil, which is basically saying women are always fickle and changeable, saying, you ladies are always against an independent attitude. You don't understand. You shouldn't really be sticking your nose in here. And that's fine. But he does make some interesting comments too, which make me think that he has, I sort of thought of him as not necessarily being super pro-Dorothea, because he's not a highly religious man. He's not a highly anything man, is he? Mr. Brooke is always, says he goes up to a certain point. And I think in the remarks he makes here, I would say that he's more in sympathy with Dorothea than Celia. You ladies are always against an independent attitude, a man's caring for nothing but truth, and that sort of thing. And there is no part of the county where opinion is narrower than it is here. Well, I think Dorothea would agree, has made comments to that effect. And I think Celia would find that remark a little bit. I think that would take her aback. Because how Celia is. Whatever people say is the way it's to be. Celia takes that as the way it should be. Doesn't question, doesn't have notions, right? Doesn't think independently, whereas Dorothea does to some degree. She's still learning a little bit how to do that properly, but she wants to, you can tell. He says, I don't mean to throw stones. He does mean to throw stones. But somebody is wanted to take the independent line, and if I don't take it, who will? So that's interesting, because even Mr. Brooke is showing that he feels constricted, just in the same way Dorothea has kind of expressed how constricted she feels by all these silly little rules and these silly ways of doing things. Mr. Brooke is revealing that to some degree he sympathizes. And so maybe the fact that he agreed to her marrying Mr. Casaubon is because maybe he also is resisting the matchmaking that must have been going on. So even though he seemed to be saying, oh, are you sure you don't want to marry Sir James Chetham? Maybe he was already thinking in his mind, she might not, and I should give her some space, because there may be more pressures, and we'll see more pressures coming from elsewhere about this marriage. I'm going to read a little bit of page 55, just up to where you can see that blue line, because, we're coming to a sort of a point where the plot turns, and so that's where I kind of want to stop. Because what Mrs. Cadwallader says is, when he says, well, if I'm not independent, who will be? And she sort of says, why, any upstart who has got neither blood nor position. In other words, radical thought in the mind of Mrs. Cadwallader, I'm reading my notes there, is for those with little to lose. Now, let's think about Mrs. Cadwallader, because at the opening of chapter 6, it was made quite clear that this woman's material circumstances, they're not so good. She's respectable, yes, but she's just sitting over the lip of that, always having to watch money. She has a lot to lose. Or maybe you could say she has a little to lose and she can't afford to lose it. But that's perhaps what makes her so staunchly, why she guards the status quo the way she does. She says people of standing should consume their independent nonsense at home, and you, who are going to marry your niece as good as your daughter to one of our best men, Sir James, would be cruelly annoyed. And oh, there we go. And again, Mr. Brooke winced inwardly, as he says in the second paragraph. And now he was thinking, oh, God, what's going to happen? He said it might have been easy for ignorant observers to say to him, oh, just quarrel with Mrs. Cadwallader. But where is a country gentleman to go who quarrels with his oldest neighbours? Yeah. The isolation of country life is the difficult bit. If Mr. Brooke were living in London, he could just move house, he could get a new set of neighbours and friends, but it's not so easy in the countryside. So you can see we're coming up to a dramatic point now, because he's going to have to tell Mrs. Cadwallader the horrible, horrible news that he knows she doesn't want to hear. And again, we end this section with him saying, certainly a man can only be cosmopolitan up to a certain point. So even his attempts to be new and daring, he can only take those so far before he meets with the the immovable object that is Mrs. Cadwallader. And maybe that's how we should regard her. She's more of a function than a person. She's demonstrating how in rural England at that time there was that incredible social pressure and those boundaries, and they were hard set, and it was very, very difficult to suggest even something a little bit different. So I hope you enjoyed this session. We're going to come back to chapter 6 and finish it up and see what happens when Mrs. Cadwallader finds out who Dorothea is actually going to marry. Right. Stay tuned. Take care, everybody. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.